Fernando Guerra. I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University. I have a joint appointment in the Chicana, Chicano, Latina, Latino Studies Department and also in the Political Science Department. I also have the honor of being the director of the Center for the Study of Los Angeles, where we conduct public opinion surveys, community studies, and take a look at the major trends impacting Los Angeles to try to help people understand LA, especially decision makers. I've been at Loyola Marymount University for 35 years. So in American elections, there are all kinds of different typologies that we can use, but one is what we call at-large versus district elections. And so it's not unusual for most small cities to have at-large elections. And that just simply means that every voter will vote for all 5 council members that get elected. That every council member that gets elected in a city has to represent the city in its entirety. In larger cities, because they become too large, we create districts. And so in the city of Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, the larger cities, they almost always have districts, and therefore only the voters in District A or 1 vote for that representative that will then focus their representation on that same district. And so that's the difference. In cities where we have districts, voters or viewers can think about an at-large as the mayor. The mayor is always elected at large because he represents the whole city. Or the governor is always elected at large, he represents the whole state. But representatives are typically elected in districts which carve up the state so that geographically we can have representation throughout the state, that it's not too focused on one area or the other. So as a particular group, whether it's ethnic, partisan, or any other matter, begins to emerge in an at-large election, if one makes the assumption that these groups are either segregated or geographically isolated, number one, and that they are in fact voting as a block and there is polarized voting, meaning that Latinos want Latino representation and begin to vote for candidates that will represent their interests, whether they're Latino or not. But another group, such as whites, continue to view things differently and vote another way, you end up with polarized voting. And in that situation, that means that there's only one electorate, no districts, only at large, that the majority will vote and win all 5 council seats, let's say, in an at-large system, or will continuously win the at-large election. Districts divide that up, but at-large elections in multiple academic studies have clearly indicated that they are biased against Latinos, African Americans, or even geographic minorities. So the state of California has traditionally had district elections for its state legislature, very similar to congressional districts throughout the country. Every state has the right to determine how to elect its own members of Congress, how to elect its own state legislature. And so it's not a given that a state has to have districts, but the vast majority of states have created districts. And they mostly did this not having anything to do with ethnicity, but having to do with geography, that they wanted to make sure that every geographic area got represented. And this was the best method by having district elections versus at-large elections. And therefore, depending on whether you have 5 districts in a city or 40 districts in the state of California or 80 districts in terms of the state assembly, somebody has to draw those districts. And what criteria you use to draw those districts will obviously determine the representation. Drawing the districts is really a activity where the party elite or the elected elite or the actual representatives are selecting their voters, not the voters selecting their representatives. Literally, the power that be sit around and decide how to draw the lines, which communities, which voters will be in which district. This, of course, has the tendency to be manipulated and has consistently been manipulated since the beginning of the American Republic. And that's actually a process we call gerrymandering, which is actually named after a early governor of the state of Massachusetts who began manipulating these lines. And these lines are manipulated for all kinds of reasons, good reasons and bad reasons, neutral reasons, reasons that have to do with geographic boundaries, but also reasons that have to do with trying to increase the power of one group or another. And as it's obvious and historical, is that's usually been used to dilute the vote of minorities like Latinos and African Americans. So if you start in post-World War II California, there was very little Latino representation. And you have some early pioneers like Ed Roybal, who won at the LA City Council and then won at the congressional level. Many Latinos were excluded from political office because the way the lines were drawn, they fractured the Latino community. We know where the Latino community was located. We know that there were enough residents and even enough voters to create a congressional district, a city council district, a supervisorial district, a state legislative district that would lead to Latino representation. Maybe not a Latino elected official, but someone who the Latino community would want to represent them. But through gerrymandering or redistricting, these districts were never drawn, and the Latino community was typically fractured, meaning it was put into different districts as a small sliver, and it could never elect a Latino directly. As the Latino population grew, it became more and more difficult to do that. And so they get to a certain point where they say, look, there's too many of them. If we fracture them, they actually might get elected in 2 or 3 districts. So now let's do the opposite. Instead of fracturing the Latino community, let's compact it and put them all into one district. Sure, they'll get to elect one Latino, or a representative who will be the choice of the Latino electorate, but at least they'll only elect one by putting all the voters into that. And that's how we start creating the very first Latino districts, and they're heavily, heavily Latino. And so that process continues. And as the demographic shift occurs and more Latinos start to come of age, start to register, are U.S. citizens, et cetera, there's a need to create more districts, but that becomes very political, but you can't escape that, and you see more and more Latinos being elected, along with African Americans. And those individuals, those ethnic individuals, along with other Democrats, begin to capture the majority of the districts in California. And that, I think, begins to change the makeup of the state legislature. So even though the statewide, that is the at-large election for governor, or the at-large election for president in California, continues to go Republican, the districts are much more competitive, and as a matter of fact, Democrats begin to win and are actually the majority up in the state legislature. So in California, we have representative government, which is the election of the state legislature and statewide elected officials. We also have a direct democracy, which is the referendum, the recall, and the initiative. And in the state, we have district elections for state assembly members and state senators who make up the state legislature. But all the other elections are at large, meaning that every single Californian gets to vote on these. And so you could view Proposition 187 and the initiative process as an at-large election. You could tell before '94 that Republicans and conservatives were beginning to lose representative power through the district system. And it was much more difficult for them to get laws through the state assembly and state senate because now it was majority Democrats. But at the at-large level, meaning the governor and the propositions and initiatives, it was still at large. And whites, more specifically conservatives, still had greater sway in an at-large system than they did in individual districts. And so towards the transition of power from mostly Republican to mostly Democrats, it's not unusual for Republicans and conservatives to then start using the initiative process to continue to make public policy as they end up losing power. Then after that, the third aspect is oftentimes to try to impact the courts and solidify and appoint judges that will then maintain that as well. So first you want to gain representative power through districts, then at large at statewide elections, then at large through the initiative process, and then the judicial process. If you can control all four, like in many southern states today, that's not a problem. But in a transition where you've had all four and you're beginning to lose one or the other, you continue to use that arena that's still to your advantage, and that's at-large elections, statewide elections, and that's what was happening in 1994. So Proposition 187 came about in 1994. We saw a tremendous economic recession happening in the 90s, a great, tremendous real estate downturn, but there were also social dislocation. You had the tremendous drug epidemic in terms of Los Angeles. You had the riots that happened in Los Angeles. You had the earthquakes in San Francisco in '89 and an earthquake in '94 here in Southern California in Northridge. You had all of this tremendous amount of fires, the very first set of wildfires that we're now getting used to, but were new to us really. It seemed like California was falling apart economically, politically, socially, environmentally. We felt like we were under attack. And what was different? Well, the number of Latinos and immigrants that were in our presence. That's what felt like different. So we must therefore attack them. 187 was an attack on immigrants because they were being scapegoated for the riots, the recession, the real estate downturn, even the earthquakes. You know, unfortunately, we associate several trends that are happening at the same time as though they're causing one another, when in fact they could be caused by a same trend, but they're not really, they're correlated, but they're not causal. Oftentimes when change happens economically, politically, socially, it's attributed to other change that we could easily see, which is demographic. And so when you see a demographic shift occur at the same time as an economic downturn, you blame it on that demographic shift. When you see crime increase for all kinds of other social issues, but you see demographic shift occur, you blame it on that demographic shift. Even though the data tells you that immigrant communities are safer, immigrant communities cause less crime, it doesn't matter. You associate that demographic shift with the increase in crime, with the economic downturn, with a social dislocation, with a health crisis, etc. It's always been that way for us to look for a simple answer, a simple association. And that's, I think, where fear comes from, because you are afraid, you are being impacted by these changes, economic, political, or otherwise, and you're looking for an explanation that will help you dissuade that fear. And one of the ways of doing it is by knowing what the cause is. And it's simply to say the cause are immigrants. The cause is this demographic issue. Now I know what the origins is. I can try to mitigate that, impact that, prevent that from happening. And that's where that fear plays itself out in politics and in social interactions. Proposition 187 was many things. In the most basic, up-to-date in the 1994, it was a campaign tactic to get Governor Wilson elected, number one. Number two, it was a proposition to communicate that there were many Californians who were fed up with Latino immigration and the Latino community. Those two things immediate, and it manifests itself in the November 1994 election. Beyond that, it became a symbol of the attack and the exclusion of Latinos in California. It became a target for Latinos to say, this is what will happen if you and we as a community continue to be passive and not mobilize. And so that became the rallying cry for many, many Latinos, both citizens and non-citizens, young and old, and they immediately knew that 187 and Governor Wilson were anti-Latino, even though the proponents of both campaigns said that wasn't the case. You could feel it instinctively the way those commercials proposing 187 were, how they were viewed. You could feel instinctively that 187 was anti-Latino by the words that were used and how it was presented to the California voter. And you knew instinctively that it was something that would impact Latinos, not only non-citizens, but every type of Latino, and that it was scapegoating the Latino community, and if 187 was taken to its fullest extent, would have a draconian impact on every single Latino community. Even if you were not a immigrant or undocumented, most of us come from melded families where some of us are, some of us aren't. We definitely live in neighborhoods where some of us are undocumented and some of us are not. We work in locations where some of us are documented, some of us are not. Every Latino was going to be impacted if 187 was to be implemented. And we would not only be impacted, physically in terms of some being removed, but we would be impacted economically in terms of our household incomes. We would be impacted psychologically by the disappearance immediately of many of our family, neighbors, co-workers. We would be impacted from a community perspective because it would be in many ways ravaged and devastated. And instinctively, you didn't have to be able to articulate it. You didn't have to be able to talk about it in concrete legal matters, whatever. You just knew in your gut that it was going to be a devastating initiative to the Latino community. When I think about 187 in the context, I think about three different levels. One is, kind of a very historical and worldwide, and that is it's not unusual to always try to scapegoat the other and scapegoat minorities, whether they're ethnic, religious, national origin, when there are crises and economic downturns. I see 187 as part of that trend that has been happening historically and worldwide, and unfortunately it continues today and will probably continue into the future. That's one level. The second level, of course, is specifically California and what was happening in California at that time, the economic, social, and political environment of that time. California in the early 90s was going through probably the worst recession in California's history since the Great Depression. Now, of course, it would be superseded by another great recession in the late 2000s, but in 94, that was the worst recession that California and the United States had ever seen since the Great Depression. It was also a tremendous real estate downturn. On average, anywhere from 10 to 30% of many homes throughout California had lost value of anywhere from 20 to 30%. So Californians were concerned about the economy, they were concerned about their jobs, they were concerned about the greatest investment that most of them had made, that is their homes, losing tremendous amount of value. And there seemed to be no solutions, and the incumbent government at that time, headed by Governor Wilson, had no answers. And so going into an election, you have to be held accountable to that. And there was no accounting, there was no explanation. Governor Wilson could not explain why this was happening, but more importantly, he could not explain how he was going to help California get out of this. And so he began a process of scapegoating, not only 187, but other aspects. And so California was going through this incredible economic issue. It had continued to also go through tremendous demographic transition that was happening. And we are at one of the heights of the highest number of immigrants who lived in California, both documented and undocumented. So people could see in the faces of Californians that it was changing and that it was different. And they could also see that the economy was different, and they were conflating the two, saying the economy is different because people look differently. And if we could change how people look, meaning let's get rid of immigrants, maybe we can go back to that great economy. And so that was the economic and the political context, the economic and the demographic context. The political context was that, every 4 years we have an election. And California was beginning to go through somewhat of a transition in that the Democrats were becoming more competitive. Historically, California had always been a Republican state. Today, we talk about red and blue states. California, up until the 90s, was a reliably red state. It had voted for the Republican candidate for president for the last 40 years or so, with one or two exceptions. So you could almost count on California being Republican. And the fact that things were now competitive were interesting, and had played a role in this in a much more competitive. We knew, most of us who were observing the 1994 election, that it was going to be a competitive election. And that it wasn't sure that Pete Wilson was going to be reelected. And so that obviously created some nervousness amongst the Wilson campaign. In addition, there's one level of what was happening with statewide California elections, in that statewide candidates, especially for governor and U.S. senator, began running with initiatives. They would sponsor an initiative that would, in a sense, capture the essence of what their campaign was going to be about. And they would also be able to fund that initiative and fund their own campaigns. And those two things together would converge and lead to a platform, a theme of issues that they would pursue. And this was not unique to Wilson or to a Democrat or Republican. It was the way statewide elections were run in California. You would have a candidate, and they would have propositions or initiatives that they were closely tied to. And so when Wilson tied himself to Proposition 187, it was a very well-known and established tactic that you tied yourself to a proposition. So the idea that Wilson and the proposition were separate is not only belied by the comments and of what happened and what transpired during that campaign, but by the tradition and the custom of the time in California elections, that major candidates tied themselves to propositions as part of their campaign. All of these things together converged. These major trends impacting California converged on the election and on utilizing Proposition 187 and scapegoating immigrants, mostly immigrants of Mexican origin. When the marches of 187 during that campaign occurred, they weren't campaign marches, they were protests. They were protests against the way the political system, not just Wilson, not just 187, but the whole political system had treated the Latino community. And it was a protest about, you are using us, scapegoating us for political reasons. You have a political system that doesn't include us. And we want to be heard. We're not going to remain invisible. And especially the young folks went out there and marched and protested. They weren't mobilizing in the traditional political campaign to register to vote, get out the vote, go and defeat this proposition. It was pretty clear to most of the leaders and to most Latinos, given the polling, given the way votes work, that 187 was going to pass. This was about protesting and communicating to not only California, but society at large, that Latinos weren't just going to sit back and take it, that they weren't just going to say, hey, this is okay, we're going to lose this election, we were never going to win it, we're not going to do anything about it. And this really prepares the groundwork for the creation of activists and a whole generation that then continues to communicate and talk about this, and how Latinos view themselves much more proactively, not to be just reactive and be victims, but to be agents of change. And that's what the protests and the marches of 187 were, to be agents of change, not in that immediate election cycle, but for the next decade or two. And it absolutely happened, that these young people who marched became the agents of change and have changed the face of California politically, economically, and socially. If I was running a political campaign and quote unquote was in charge of the protests or the marches and was trying to win the campaign, I never would have done it that way. I never would have had the Mexican flags. I never would have had walking on freeways. I never would have had kids leaving schools, because that all further alienated some of the actual voters that we wanted. But even alienating those, 187, I think, would still have lost. Would have won. 187 won with 59% of the vote. Had those marches not occurred, it still would have won, but maybe not with 59%, but maybe with 55%. And so I could actually say and believe that the marches and the protests actually caused 187 to pass with a greater vote than it would have otherwise. But it would have made no difference. And so I think it was worth alienating a small group of white voters for the long term. There were short-term political costs. 187 passed. Some white voters were alienated, but there were long-term political gains. Clearly, 187 had a tremendous impact on Latino consciousness, Latino political mobilization, but it also impacted other communities, including the white community, and especially the Asian community. Many people didn't realize that Asian communities understood that this was anti-immigrant and understood that they were immigrants and that this would negatively impact them if implemented. We talked often about how after 187, so many Latinos became Democrats, and the impact that they had on the political makeup and partisanship makeup of leadership was tremendous and well documented. But it also the case that Asians actually moved more politically than even Latinos. For instance, in general, before 187, all things being equal, about 60% of Latino voters would vote for the Democrat, 40% for the Republican. Now it's 70-30, sometimes a little bit more, but roughly 70-75, to 30-35 for Latinos. The Asian community, before 187, again, generally speaking, was about 50-50. Asian voters, all things being equal, about 50% voted Democrat, 50% voted Republican. After 187 and the passage of time, Asians now vote about 75% Democrat, 25% Republican. Asian voters, as a percentage of the vote to Democrats, have moved more than Latino voters. And so we talk about the impact of 187 on Latino and Latino politics. It actually had, from this measure of how they vote, had a much greater impact on Asians and the Asian community. And so California is blue not only because of Latinos, but because of the Asian vote, but because of the traditional African American vote, and also the white vote that has also moved to the left, not tolerating anti-immigrant rhetoric that you saw in 187. It was typically understood that, and constantly made the argument of those who are restrictive immigrant groups, those that want to restrict immigration, make the argument that immigrant hurts the poorest U.S. citizens and it hurts the African American community. The argument constantly is that immigrants are going to take the jobs disproportionately from African American workers as opposed to white workers, that African Americans should be more anti-immigrant than white workers. At least that's the argument that the proponents of restrictive immigrant policies usually make. But African Americans have a history, they have a civil rights history, they have a history of being scapegoated against, they have a history of being excluded and their political representation being diluted. They understand that intuitively and have not in any way responded in terms of how they vote. And so you see that African Americans have consistently been pro-immigrant in terms of as a civil rights. Are they as pro-immigrant as Latinos? No, but certainly a lot more than conservative voters. So the African American community has been a consistent ally for Latinos when being and fighting off anti-immigrant legislation and politics. So there's a very simple diagram where representatives are in the middle, but how do they get there is that they have to mobilize their voters. And so before you get a representative, there has to be mobilization on behalf of that candidate, type of candidate, group of candidate. And this mobilization can be impacted obviously by the number of votes, but also organizations, campaigns to get out that vote. And that has improved within the Latino community. So that mobilization leads to greater representation, meaning simply more Latinos in political power. And then the more Latinos you have in political power, the more they have impacted public policy, either by being very direct and proposing legislation that is favorable to all Californians, including Latinos, or by thwarting or preventing legislation that would have an adverse effect on Latinos. And that is clearly what has happened over the last couple of decades, where Latinos are now part of the progressive democratic regime that governs California. Not only are they part of it, they are a significant member that without their participation, the regime would not win power and would not be able to govern. And so they are a significant coalition member that must be incorporated in decision making. And any anti-Latino legislation or campaign would not be tolerated by that coalition because one of its critical members is the Latino community. And so while Latinos had a history of exclusion, now they went through representation, meaning being there, but now they are part of that governing coalition. And so from exclusion to not only inclusion, but significant inclusion at all levels, including the leadership level, which impacts public policy. It's always interesting to talk about Latino participation. There's this cultural explanation that many people use that Latinos just don't participate in politics. It's not in their nature. It's not in their culture. And nothing could be further from the truth. Latinos in Mexico, Mexicans, participate in elections at a higher rate than Americans do. For most of its history, if Puerto Rico were a state, it would have higher than average participation. And so Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Central Americans have participated in politics to a greater degree than Americans participate. Yet they then come to America and stop participating. The most interesting case would be Puerto Ricans who, when they come to America, are still U.S. citizens, yet their participation levels plummet. It's not the individual Latino, it's not Latino culture. It is the American political system of elections that dilutes and prevents participation. And so that, to me, is clear in the data when you take a look at it and when you make this comparison. And so the question becomes, how do you mobilize and how do you overcome this electoral system that has a tendency to dilute minority voting? And one of the ways, of course, is to pay attention to Latino voters, speak to Latino voters about their issues, and speak to them with the right spokesperson. If you do that, you will not only get Latino voters at the same level as non-Latino voters, white voters, but can even surpass it. Now, saying that doesn't mean that it's easy. It's a very difficult job, and mostly because campaigns are short-term organizations. Campaigns exist for about a year to get an individual elected, and then they go away. They're not sustainable. And so their outreach has to be very efficient. And we have developed in America that the standard way you run a campaign is by focusing on those that already vote and have a history of vote, and you ignore the rest, which then perpetuates the lack of contact, the lack of incorporation of unlikely voters, meaning Latinos. There have been numerous experiments, numerous studies, mostly by young Latino social scientists, political scientists, who say, if you communicate to Latinos, they will come out to vote. And the experiment typically is to focus on a neighborhood, on a small jurisdiction, and actually communicate to them, and then watch what happens. And what do you think happens? The Latino vote in that area where they're experimented increases tremendously. Why? Because they were communicating to them, but not just communicating in general with the general campaign themes, but with the issues that were important to Latinos. And then once that happens, the turnout increases. The challenge, though, with this experiment is that you have to be able to scale it to a congressional district, to the state as a whole, number one, and you have to be able to sustain it. And that requires tremendous amount of resources. And the powers that be, the political party, the political system, political campaigns, don't put resources into that. So I can create an experiment, focus on a Latino neighborhood, and increase turnout. But I could only do it at a very small scale, 3 or 4 blocks. I could do that individually. But I need more resources, I need more people, I need more expertise to do it at a wider scale. But the campaigns won't give me the resources to do it. The political party won't give me the resources to do it. The corporations and others who fund campaigns won't invest in me to do it because they're doing other things and they're too distracted. And so Latinos will vote. It's actually in the culture of Latinos, historically throughout Latin America, to vote and to participate. But it's also in the culture of American political institutions to dilute that vote. And so we have to figure out how to overcome that. Latinos were present in the California state legislature since the founding of California, and they were there till the 19-teens, and then they disappeared. The great demographic transition that happened in California, not because Latino immigrants or Asian immigrants came in, but I'm talking about the demographic transition that happened in the teens and the 20s when many Eastern and Midwesterners arrived in California. And the Latinos were excluded from political power, from representation in the state legislature until 1962, when 2 Latinos got elected. But almost immediately, one didn't get reelected, and then the second one only got reelected once, so they were immediately gone. So we went from complete exclusion to some very quick, totally underrepresentation, but at least symbolically, an assembly member or two, to then again exclusion. And that takes us up to 1967. In that year, 1967, 120 state legislators, not one Latino. And in 68, one gets elected. And then in 70, 2 more get elected. And then in 74, several more get elected. But it stabilizes. But really, it begins to change in the 1990s because of 187 mobilizing Latinos, and including in 1994. Because while Latinos and Democrats lost the fight in terms of statewide at-large election for governor and for Proposition 187, Latinos actually won several seats at the district level that they hadn't won before. And so you go from only 3 Latinos in 1990 in the state assembly to 4 in 92, 7 in 94, then 9 in 96, 11 in 98, and you keep going to the point now where there's over 30 Latinos in the state legislature, and several of the legislative leaders or speakers of the assembly have been Latino. And you see this amazing transition that has happened. It's very easy to document the growth of the Latino vote. We know the number of Latinos who are in the population. We know the number who are eligible. We know the number who have registered. And we also know the number that turn out. And there are methods that we can use. So we can tell you the growth of the Latino vote has been very consistent. It's documentable. It comes from governmental documents and offices. It's indisputable. And there's no doubt that there's been a growth in the Latino voter, both in size and scope, number one, and that the Latino vote has increased more and more for Democratic or progressive candidates. So that combination of the increase of the Latino vote, number one, and number two, it becoming even more Democratic, had a 1-2 punch in terms of its impact on California politics. As a political scientist who tracks voting, political representation, 1994 is actually a great year to track this because before 94, California is a red state. After 94, California becomes a blue state. It's just that simple. and we can track it in many ways. But one of the things that we've seen is in the makeup of the state legislature in terms of Democrat, Republican, makeup in terms of the registered voters in terms of Democrat, Republican, makeup in actual voters. And in all of these measures or metrics that we political scientists take a look at, in every single metric, you have seen a change of California becoming much more democratic, much more progressive, all of it being led by the inclusion of Latinos. And so this change is very well documented. In California, there are over 8,500 elected offices. Most of them are nonpartisan by the state constitution. Only 186 are what we call partisan offices. In California, there are 186 partisan offices, which means when you run as a candidate, you have to identify as either a Republican or a Democrat or some other political party. In 1994, of these 186, and these are the most significant offices, congressional, state legislative, statewide, you add these up, in 1994, 50% were held by Democrats, 50% were held by Republicans. You fast forward to 2019, 2020, 80% are now held by Democrats and 20% are now held by Republicans. You could see the dramatic change. The other change you can see is in the inability of the Republican Party to attract young voters, Latino or otherwise. Today, the number of registered Republicans is below 25% statewide, something like 15% in the county of Los Angeles, under 10% in the city of Los Angeles. A city of 4 million people, only 10% of registered voters are Republican. It's almost un-Angelino, un-Californian to register as a Republican for what they try to do to this great state back in 1994. Republicans are being punished and continue to be punished for trying to, on a short gain scenario, that is win a campaign in 94, to try to ruin the state of California. And not only Latinos, not only Asians, but African Americans, working people, whites, young people, do not forgive the Republican Party for what they try to do to this great state, and they will be punished for at least another generation to come. The interesting thing about American politics is federalism and the ability of every state to have its own political culture, its own political rules. And so oftentimes what happens in one state is completely different that's happening in another state. And every state's an experiment in terms of new politics, new trends, et cetera. But sometimes there's some patterns that you see begin in one state that they pick up on another and continue. California in the 90s is a clear indication of where many more states, like Arizona or Texas or Nevada, will emerge, and the nation as a whole. And so what we saw in 1994 being played out in California, we see in 2016 to 2020 being played out in the United States. Again, you have a very similar scenario where the two political parties are actually pretty even, almost 50-50. You see it in Congress, where one controls the House, one controls the Senate, one controlled both chambers, and then in 2 or 3 years later, the other controls 2 chambers. You see it in the Electoral College. Incredibly partisan equality in terms of Democrats and Republicans. That was California in 1994. In California in 1994, it was very evenly divided in a partisan way like the United States is today. But you could also see a trend for a variety of different reasons, demographics, values, ideology, that if present trends continue, that Democrats will inch forward more and more and begin to capture the majority. And the strategy then, when that transition is happening for Republicans, has been to scare and mobilize their base. You can't offer hope because the demographics show that you're going to decline. So you offer fear. And unfortunately, we want to think that hope is the great mobilizer, that hope for a better quality of life, for equality, will mobilize you to come. But in reality, fear is a much greater mobilizer. if you want to run faster, be scared, not hopeful. And that's what Republicans are doing. They are scaring their constituents to run faster to the ballot box, to preserve their privilege, because they know that at the end of the day, Democrats, Latinos, progressives are going to capture the majority. That's what's happening today in 2016 to 2020 with the current president trying to scare his base to remain mobilized, to remain fearful, so that he can maintain that power. Exactly the same scenario that happened in California in '94. So Pete Wilson won in '94. Donald Trump won in 2016. But the Republican Party lost after that. What happened in California will happen to the Republican Party at the national level, not just because of Latinos, but because of Asians, African Americans, and more importantly, white progressives, that they will change that political map that we've been so used to in the last 20 years, and they will change it to a much more progressive political map. More people equals more economic growth. When a economy, a society stagnates demographically, it will stagnate economically. We know that from economic research. We know that from some of the most basic economic principles, but we also know that from countries who in fact have stagnated in terms of their population, have then equally stagnated in terms of their economy. And so you have to have more people for economic production, for economic consumption. And with the birth rates that we have in the United States and most of other Western European countries, without immigration, these economies will dwindle. And so you need immigrants to reinvigorate not only the economy, but also the culture, the society. Because just as I was talking about economics stagnates, even culturally, a country can stagnate and maintain and try not new ideas, try not new creative, not new innovations. But when the immigrants arrive, whether they're from Latin America or India or China or wherever they come from, they will not only help the economy, they will help with the creative arts, they will help with innovation in terms of high tech, they will help society as a whole to continue that process of what we call the American experience, and not only culturally, historically, but economically and politically. There will always be politicians, candidates, who are willing to scapegoat a community for short-term political gain. There will always be a demagogue out there who will try to scare you to be afraid of some of your fellow Americans, and that we must be vigilant and create institutions to protect us from that. That will happen. It happened in '94. It's happening in 2016. The number one lesson to me is scapegoating is not historical. It happens in contemporary America, contemporary California. That's number one. Number two is that there could be political costs to that. There may be short gains, but there are long-term gains when you scapegoat, when you play to people's worst fears. You will be punished for that politically and in other ways. So yes, there will be scapegoating, but you will pay for that as a candidate or political party when you do that.